I talked about Will in our last meeting. So I'm just going to introduce him very briefly and just say that Will is a professor of sound recording technology and music at UMass Lowell. And in the department that James is a graduate of, as you can tell by the dancing over there in that little box. I think some of you know, even though I was a professor of computer science, I did a lot of work with professors in the Department of Music. I never worked directly with Will, but we certainly had a number of fun conversations, that's for sure. And Will is quite knowledgeable about the Beatles, and so he might talk about that a little bit. But he, as I said last week, he's not going to talk technical stuff. He does have a Grammy, believe it or not, for some of the work that he's done in sound recording technology. So he's the real McCoy, but he's not going to hit us with all these technical things. I'm sure all of us have our hands full just doing the recordings that we currently do. So Will is instead, we're going to call this a fireside chat. As I introduced, Will's been in the music business for about half a century now, and yeah, he's shying away. But yeah, like the other guys here, I graduated from college in 1970, so for me it's over half a century too. So okay, so Will is he's got some remarks he's going to make, but you guys all know how to raise your hand and jump in, and Will is more than happy to just make this very informal and discussion. I think that's about it. Will, take it away.
All right. Well, I have absolutely no planned presentation or how to navigate this. So why don't I just sort of start with how I got into being in the recording industry. I grew up as a performing musician, and I started playing professionally when I was 13. I was touring with a rock band when I was 14 and opening for big acts. And the recording process was very much entwined with the act of making music on stage for me. As strange as that might sound, I was doing overdubs for the performances in well, that would have been in the early 70s that I was doing overdubs on stage and having that happen. So when I got into the recording industry itself, it was later on in the late 70s, 78 is when I started making my first records. So playing on stage was actually very fundamental to how I got into it. So I went into it as a performer, as a composer, and as a conductor. I really started my very first interest in the recording process as a conductor, listening to the recording that was very different from what I heard on the podium. And the changes fascinated me. And that really pulled me into that process. So by the time I was making my first recordings, I was very well developed as a musician, to the point where the musicianship really shaped me as a recording engineer. So let me just give you an anecdote about how important that was to my career. This was 1978. I was in my mid-20s, and I got to the point, serendipitously, that I was an assistant engineer for a recording by the National Symphony. And it was a recording project of the National Symphony. And they were doing Tchaikovsky's Second Violin Concerto. I learned the score. As an assistant, I learned the score intricately. As an assistant, I did not need to do that. But I was already a skilled classical musician, and I applied myself to memorizing the score. And in the recording session, it was my job to run the tape recorder, the analog tape recorder, the big wheels, and you get those guys going, and it's real hard to stop them at the right spot, but it was my job to do that. That was my only job, is to get the thing to the right spot. Well, that's not an easy thing to do once it gets up to speed, but that was my job. So throughout the course of the recording process, things were going reasonably well. And then it was, the producer asked me to go back to the second take. And we were like on take 7, but he wanted to go back and listen to something and go back, but I overshot it. And I overshot it by maybe 30 seconds. And then I had to shuffle back. But when I shuffled back and I hit play and it was at the right spot, he told me that I had wasted $40,000 of studio time. And that kind of made me shake in my shoes. And the engineer looked over at me like, well, you're gone. You're just dead. You know, this is the end of your career. If you make it through the night, you're lucky. But, and I'm pointing this out because all of you are involved in performing, and all of you are involved in this process of making music together. So to know the score, to know the piece of music well enough so that you know what other people are doing and you know where things are at any moment in time is hugely helpful for this process of being able to jump from one place to another, but also knowing how everything pulls together. So because I knew the score and I knew how to shuffle back, that producer didn't fire me for wasting money and wasting time. And the engineer told me that I was the first one who had made a mistake in a recording session that he did not fire immediately. And after I got to know him for a couple of months, I asked him why he didn't fire me immediately. And his response was, I knew exactly what was wrong and how to fix it in terms of where things were. So, and I point that out because as performing musicians, to know where you are at every moment in time is terrifically important. And James will tell you that I stress that throughout the whole process of learning music and understanding music, to get inside of it and to know it in a very organic way, how everything comes together. So my travel through the recording process and the music making process took me in many different directions. So in the late 80s, late 70s rather, I was recording the National Symphony as an assistant. And that brought me to be an engineer for the Aspen Music Festival. And that brought me to be an engineer for many very fine classical recording artists. And I found myself in New York City as an independent freelance engineer. I was busy for basically from noon on Friday until midnight on Sunday in a recording session, just continually. And I would break for a meal and I'd catch a cat nap, but I'd go back into the session. But these were all classical sessions. And so throughout the early 80s, I was getting this reputation of someone who could edit well. And I could edit a recording session of an orchestra. I could edit a recording session of various ensembles. So the ensembles got to be pretty complex. And one of the recording studios that I was stationed at in editing some of these classical projects with big name artists. One of those recording studios that I worked at was the Record Plant on 44th Street. And the Record Plant East became part of the Hit Factory in a few years later. But when I was there in the mid 80s, doing basically complex editing of orchestral works, the people around me were rock musicians and jazz musicians and some classical musicians, and they were watching me edit. And they were watching that I had a sense of fearlessness, that I would mark where it was and I'd strike it and I'd cut it. And I would go through a master tape making maybe 30 edits an hour, and other people would take much more time than that. So the reputation was that I could identify points quickly and easily. And when you slow down an analog tape, I know some of you have that vintage in your head, things just get morphed in very, very different ways. So I just learned how to do that. It was an intuitive thing to me that if the waveform is doing this and it's being slowed down, then this is happening, and this is happening for frequency, and this is happening for time. And I just latched into that. So I got the sense that when things were complicated in the recording studio, I would get engineers and assistant engineers from other projects that would ask me my opinion about an edit spot. And they were, you know, because there was a camaraderie of sorts, and I was a freelancer, and most everybody was freelancers. There were staff engineers, but the staff engineers mostly helped the freelancers with technical issues. So I would get these questions once in a while, and one day a man came into the studio and he said, everybody on my staff is afraid to edit this one recording, and we need to edit it because we are going to reissue a remaster of this. And I said, well, what's the issue? And he said, we cannot find a good edit point. We cannot find a place where this won't happen, and that won't happen, and that won't happen. And I said, well, would you like me to listen to it? And the guy said, not only would we like you to listen to it, we'd like you to do it. And I thought, well, okay. I can take an hour, I can take a half hour, I can take 2 hours and go on someone else's clock for a little bit. And so I went in, and they said, now we want the edit to be between the first verse and the first chorus. I said, well, that's pretty much where you always make edit points in pop tunes. And it's a rock tune, so this is going to be easy. So turned on recording and started listening to it, and it was John Lennon. And that he was in the process of singing Stand By Me. This was from his 1975 rock and roll album, and it was the master tape. Well, it might be second generation because they weren't going to put a razor blade to the master tape, but it was early on in the process. And I had quit smoking a few years before. And I looked at the guy and said, I can do this, but I have to buy a pack of cigarettes. Because it was overwhelming to now I need to put a razor blade to John Lennon. So I worked through it and made it happen. I found an edit point. Nobody else could hear the edit after I made it. And then I made a couple more edits later on. I didn't get credit. I got a check. That's the way it goes sometimes. But the fact that I was able to work on a John Lennon song, and especially that song from 1975, that was the album right before his 5-year retirement. Okay, so right after he did that album, he took his 5-year retirement to be a father and bake bread and the like. Well, he continued to record music, and that's where Double Fantasy came out the other end. So by the late 80s, things were really, really changing in the recording industry. And the reason why I had to do that edit in 85 was because that particular recording was being reissued for CD. So some of you are going to remember that everything was on LP, and that when the CDs started coming out, it was a brave new world, and it was very terrifically different. And I had to ride that bleeding edge from analog into the full digital age. And there were many iterations and changes that happened along that line and along those times. So I could talk like an old person for a long time, or I could talk about any particular issues or questions you have, or I could talk about some of the artists I've worked with. And I could talk a little bit about production, but I'm not a Zoom person. In fact, I have avoided Zoom like the plague. I have taught over it for the past 1.5 years, and I know how to function, and I know how to tell students to do this and do that.
but I have avoided making it a production tool.
Okay. We have a couple of people with hands up for questions, so why don't we take those and see if they see where they take you. So Jesse first, and then Victor.
Yeah, my question, Will, is you mentioned doing overdubs on stage. I think I know what an overdub is, but I have no clue what it means to do one on stage, and I'm very curious about that, please.
Yeah. So what I did is I would lay a track on stage, and in 1970 and 71, when I was doing that, I was laying it on analog tape. And then I would make a loop of that analog tape and play against it. And that was early electronic music. So at that time, in 1970, the Moog had just been invented. And so this idea of making electronic sounds on stage was something fairly new. So I was basically taking what Jimi Hendrix did and putting it in a can. So I could do it on stage and play against myself.
Yeah, that was where, when you mentioned that, I was going to ask. So you're actually playing against yourself. So
Right.
Yeah, cool.
So at that point in time, I was playing with a six-piece ensemble, but I was the lead guitar and the rhythm guitar filling in as I needed to, and the vocalist.
Huh.
So so I was sort of the person making the mosaic behind the group. So this was 1970, and I was the person in the group who taught everybody all of their parts, because I sat in the back of the bus and listened to an 8-track and pulled off all of the parts, and everybody else was at the front of the bus making interesting clouds of smoke that if I was sitting in, I wouldn't have been able to transcribe the recording, because they would have taken me to a different point in the universe. But
Amen.
yeah.
Cool. All right, Victor, and then Jeff.
Victor?
So, hi, Bill. I started my career in theater lighting, and things have changed so drastically. I mean, it's like a different industry now than when I was in college and saw the evolution just from incandescents to
Halogen.
blanket to halogen. So could you, like, and the same has happened in audio, right? We've gone from tapes to computers. So could you just give a little flavor of the big major technical changes that have happened in sound recording and editing over your career?
Yeah. So when I started actually being a recordist, most everything was direct to 2-track. And then I worked with 4-track, and then I worked with 8-track, and ultimately 24-track. But when I was in classical, I'm talking classical, everything was direct to 2-track. And then it was 4-track, and ultimately it went to 24-track. Honestly, when things started evolving in the pop industry from the various levels of multi-track recording, I was still very young. So I wasn't involved in that analog push through the pop industry, but I was involved with it as it went through the classical world and the jazz world. So going from analog recording into digital recording was very, very difficult. Those early years of digital recording, there's a Nyquist frequency that butts up against. I know Jesse said I wasn't going to do technical stuff, but let me just throw this out, that if you don't get rid of everything above a certain frequency when you're recording digitally, you get ghost pitches that are the inverse of what is above that highest resolution of the digital format. So with 16-bit 44 1 kilohertz sampling rate,
If you got a certain pitch above that, it would be theoretically out of the hearing range, but it would be ghosted within the hearing range. So that was a real big issue, and that was the reason why digital recordings were suspect for so many years. The quality of digital did not sit well with a lot of people who were used to analog, because there were these ghost frequencies. They were very, very faint, but once you know they're there, they're like, they're like a pimple on a forehead. You can't miss them. So that process of growing the digital medium took about 10 years for it to be very reliable and for it to be functional. And fortunately, the University of UMass Lowell, I was the head of recording program there, and we became a test site for a number of companies that were developing these technologies. I did some consulting for Apple. I did some of the sounds for the first Mac, which was cool. I was offered a check or stock, and I was young enough to know that I wanted the cash, and not smart enough to know I should have taken the stock. But so we all have things like that in the rearview mirror. One of the things that happened early on that made a huge difference was the implementation of MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, and I was involved in the design of that protocol. In terms of making that protocol talk to synthesizers. And that became, Jesse knows MIDI very well, because it's really become entwined with the whole process of how computers talk to devices. So the biggest change that happened in the 90s was that everything became computerized, and everything could be resident within the computer. But when digital started, it was trying to replicate what happened with open reel tapes. So all of the editing actually took place on a tape recorder, which was really not efficient. So when I did my first 24-track digital recording in the late 80s, early 90s, I did all of the editing on the device. And then once you could start mastering to a computer, things changed quite a bit. But here's a real interesting thing. When things started migrating to the computer, we did not have this idea of non-destructive editing, where you could go back, you could try and edit and then go back if it didn't work. All of your edits were destructive. All of your edits combined sound files in a way that they could not be pulled apart. So if you made an edit and it stunk, you couldn't unstink it. You had to go back to the source tapes or the source data and start all over again. But not only that, is you would hit edit and it would compute. And sometimes it would compute for 15 minutes. I mean, you could order a pizza and eat it before that edit came through and you could listen to it. And now all of you are doing those edits as if they were meaningless. It's almost like word processing. Yeah. So I could ramble about that some more, but I think I've probably covered that. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Jeff.
Well, I guess what I'm concerned about is that, and I always hear this debate amongst some of my old rocker friends and buddies that I played with in bands. And then there's always the debate of vinyl versus digital. And I mean, that may have been relevant, as you indicated, 30 years ago. But I can't believe that discussion even still goes on nowadays, because digital has come so far, and the recording technology is so much better and so much cleaner. And it seems to me to be just miles and miles ahead of the vinyl technology and the mechanics of vinyl. But I wanted to have your take on it. Why is everyone still so enamored sometimes with what they indicate the warmth of vinyl, whatever that warmth may be?
Well, that warmth word is pretty ethereal. And I
Yeah.
think if you ask them to define what warm is, they would, if you put four of those people in the same room, but put a partition around them and force them to define warm, you wouldn't get the same thing from those folks. I guarantee that. So the way I look at this whole issue is sort of like, some days I'll have wine with dinner, and some days I'll have a different wine with dinner. And some days I'll have scotch before dinner, and some days I'll have a brandy before dinner. And so this is personal taste. And, some recordings sound better digitally, and some sound better analog. But better, just that word better, is a personal preference and a personal take. And it has really nothing to do with quality. It has to do with if you want to have peanut butter for dinner or spaghetti for dinner. It's your preference for that night and in that context. Analog, people who think analog recordings sound better have never made an analog recording. I have to tell you, it is a pain. Analog recordings, to calibrate an analog deck so it's accurate is really a bother, and they drift. So by the time you get to take 12, you've got to recalibrate. You've got to pull down the session for a little bit because everything heats up. And when everything heats up, it runs away and it moves. So you've got to put it back together. So people who think that recording analog is just this side of nirvana probably haven't done it.
So does that mean that your levels actually change on the console? You mean you have to recalibrate?
You recalibrate the machine because the electromagnetic head has changes in terms of the frequency response because of the equalizers that are grabbing the signal going to the head. Those transistors and those circuits change in temperature and they change frequency response. How much? The average person isn't going to hear it, but the people making the recordings will know it. And if you have this thing that changes and you go to splice together the first take with the 50th take, you're going to get a whole different sound quality of that instrument or ensemble. How much is a whole different? Well, it's going to be noticeable to the artists. It's going to be noticeable to audiophiles. And I bet if it was your voice, you'd know it very clearly. If it was your mother's voice, it would be unmistakable. Yeah. So those subtle changes are actually substantive. Yeah. So I didn't answer your question, Jeff.
No, I think that your answer is the same that I think is true. I think it's a person's taste in what they're looking for. But I think as far as sound reproduction, pure sound, and I guess maybe that's the word to define, pure sound reproduction, certainly, at least to my ear, is much better digitally than analog.
I think, let me reframe what you said, because I do agree with you. Digital recording now will capture the waveform with very few discrepancies. Analog recording always captures the waveform with a discrepancy of one sort or another. It's just the nature of the technology. You cannot apply a magnet to magnetic tape and have it be a photocopy. That is physically impossible. But you can do that digitally. With maybe not an exact photocopy, but it'll be really, really close, especially with high resolution formats. Yeah. So I think you're processing that correctly, Jeff.
Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like I've got your hand, Jesse, but I'm going to jump in first with my question before you ask another one. It sounds a lot like the debate between film versus digital photography. I mean, they each are to taste, but it's the same kind of thing where with film, it is an analog capturing, and there's going to be variances, whether there's that are just there that are different from the sensor in a digital camera. So speaking of digital, what's the history of, because I swear I've heard of, but I'm not sure where it fits in. And yes, this doesn't apply, it'd be anathema to the classical world, but in the rock pop world, where in the history does the beginnings of auto-tune or Melodyne or any of those other things to manage pitch, to manage timing, to manage synchronization, does any of that, did any of that occur before we went fully computerized? Was there still some ability to do that while it was still 24 track tape, or is that all technology that came after everything went to fully digital on the computer?
That was a product of digital.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I had heard somebody speaking of cutting tapes in the editing booth, cutting tapes and on the floor, and in the same breath said something about Melodyne in there, and it's like, I don't know how that would work, but
well, we had instruments that played things that could be used for tuning, and instruments that could be varied very slightly, but those were used as references. So at the head of every 24 track tape or 8 track tape, you put down tones, and those tones some of the tones were to calibrate the machine, so it's always calibrated the same way. Some of those tones are SMPTE tones, so that there's a time clock going on. So you can grab how that time is lapsing. And especially if you want to synchronize the 24 track with the 2 track so that they're always in sync. So you can go back, shuffle back and forth, and the 2 machines will align themselves with a device, a SMPTE device, a sync device.
right.
But also, and this is really, really important, and a lot of sessions ran into trouble because they didn't think to do this, is you would go to the piano in the room and you would make sure that it's precisely in tune to whatever A you want it to be. And you would put reference pitches at the head of the tape so that you could go back and know how the piano is tuned. Because the guitars can change, everyone can change. You can even get the drummers to change. But you have to have that reference, and the reference is always the piano. So to have an electronic instrument, auto-tune instrument, that's really a product of modern technology.
Okay, cool. Now, Jesse.
All right. Well, we said we would take about a half an hour of your time, Will, and we have, but I'm not letting you go till you tell us the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young story. Come on, you got to have one, man, that you can share with us.
Well, I was playing in the band that opened for them. So I traveled, this was 71. And so I opened for them for a couple of months in some of the bigger shows. And so after the first couple of sets, after the first couple of nights, I was asked to play along, beginning off stage. So I was learning the parts and playing off stage. And then I got asked once if I could sing harmony. So I learned the harmony parts of a couple of the songs. And then one night I was asked if I could play on stage. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool because this is a really great opportunity. And while I was being asked if I could play on stage, I was being asked if I could sing the harmony part of one of the 3. And I thought, well, I don't think I can emulate the timbre of that person's voice, but I could probably hit the pitches. Well, that person wasn't feeling quite well. And so I filled in for him. And then Neil Young joined after a couple of weeks. So it was the 4 of them, which was really cool because the year before I was in the back of the bus that I told you about. and I was learning various songs, and Kent State happened. And that was like a lightning bolt for me, that in May of 1970, that the National Guard are killing my people, are shooting my people. So I got to trade 8-bar phrases on stage with Neil Young in Ohio. And that was really cool. That's one of my favorite Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young stories. Yeah. And I could tell you things that I shouldn't tell you. So.
Well, I think we can all imagine.
Yeah. Well, David Crosby was really, really, really generous. He taught me a lot of things about different kinds of tunings on the guitar. And I jammed with him into the wee hours of the morning. He was on a substance that kept him up all night. And I entertained him, or he entertained me. Well, he was wound up. He was just going. And I was just there for the ride.
Yeah, no, I don't do it no mo. Tired of waking up on the floor, huh? Yeah. Well, Will, I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to thank you very much on behalf of the chorus. Really, you did talk technical stuff more than I expected, but I actually understood a good part of it, which doesn't totally surprise me, given that, again, you're a professor like me, and you know how to explain these things. And I thank you sincerely, and we all wish you the best, and look forward to when we can get together again, and with the other guys where we did the Beatles stuff together. That was such great fun.
That was great fun. I look forward to getting together too, Jesse. Well,
all right.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Will. Take care.
Thank you, Will. Enjoy your scotch.
I shall. Thank you so much. Good night, folks.
Good night.